Flexi-Wings scandal are F1 teams cheating. The FIA clamping down on cheating with Flexi-Wings in F1. Like all sports, Formula One evolves. However, unlike many other sports, the evolution in Formula One is more constant. Think about it for most sports. Significant rule changes happen once every few years. For Formula One, however, these changes happen almost by the year. It's understandable. The sport itself is dangerous, and authorities need to take action to prevent drivers from getting hurt. Just as well, Formula One is unique in that several rule changes tend to be implemented to ensure that all the teams have a level playing field. The FIA has been relentless in its pursuit of equality among all teams, and that pursuit has led to the implementation of several rules that can be controversial at times. In this video, we'll be looking at the recent ban on so-called Flexi-Wings, as well as its implications for teams in the future. A history of clampdowns. If you know anything about Formula One, the sport is about aerodynamics and engineering. When designing your car, everything has to be perfect and pinpointed to ensure that teams get the maximum performance out of the car. One little thing goes out of whack, and it could cost a driver precious seconds. And in a sport that requires precision like Formula One, this is just unacceptable. While designing every car, teams also need to work with guidelines put forward by the FIA to ensure compliance and regulatory safety. This is why the issue of Flexi-Wings has become so controversial in the past few years. So here's the thing, in the design of a Formula One car, the wing is one of the most significant components. This component dramatically impacts the vehicle's aerodynamic performance and can go a long way in determining its overall performance. Teams used to have the freedom to design their wings as they pleased, but back in the late 90s, the FIA started to really rein in this freedom. The decision was primarily to reduce the number of wing-related accidents at the time. Back in the day, teams were essentially looking to use flexing rear wings to create an effect where the rear wing would tilt rearwards under considerable load, thus giving the proper downforce when the car is at low speeds, while also cutting drag as the car starts speeding up. But the FIA eventually came forward with a rule that put a hold on teams' ability to use these wings to their advantage. Article 3.22 of the FIA's technical regulations dictates that every component of a car's aerodynamic performance, including the wings, must be tightly secured to the vehicle. And as the car performs, these components would need to remain rigid. The FIA introduced a load test requirement to ensure a little leeway. Here, scrutineers would be able to pull on the rear wing to a maximum of about 100 kilograms, thus allowing them to detect if there is any adverse rear flex. If a wing displayed this flex, it would be deemed illegal as it essentially flexed outside the bounds of the FIA's regulations. You see, the challenge here is that it is almost impossible to ensure that a component in an F1 car remains rigid throughout. And with this ambiguity, teams eventually found ways to work around the FIA's regulations and introduce a little lag and flex on their wings again. In mid-2006, straight-line speeds started to become a thing again, and the FIA soon realized that teams had found an interesting way to evade the flexible wing regulations. Instead of causing the wing to tilt the entire way back, teams designed their rear wing planes so that an increase in speed would cause the gap between the top flap and the main plane to close up. Since airflow wouldn't be able to circulate around the wing, it would be stalled, thus reducing downforce while increasing straight-line speed. As the car slowed down, the gap would open again, restoring downforce. The FIA's technicians decided to take action against this, introducing slot gap separators from the 2006 Canadian Grand Prix. The separators helped to prevent a closure of the gaps as more load was applied, solving the problem. Lingering issues for the FIA. Despite this, Flexi-Wings still continue to be a problem. Notably, the FIA and many other teams on the grid especially had an issue with Red Bull and the fact that the teams seemed to always flout these Flexi-Wing regulations in some way or another. You see, it wasn't necessarily like Red Bull was the only team trying to work around Flexi-Wings. Instead, they seemed to always have the best strategies for applying aeroelasticity to the front wings while also passing the FIA's load tests. In reality, the truth was that the load tests themselves were kind of a problem. At the end of the day, the tests themselves were stationary. So teams had enough time to work around them and circumvent them. It wasn't necessarily a Red Bull thing. Over time, everyone could work around the load tests and the FIA's Flexi-Wing ruling. Teams did this in their own way, but the result was the same. They used aeroelasticity techniques to circumvent the FIA's rules, building their wings so that the outer tips pointed towards the ground. Besides changing the airflow mechanism around the front tires, this effect would also reduce downforce while the car moved. Once again, the FIA noticed this trend and was swift to act. The goal was to ensure that rules would keep changing based on team innovations, and this led to the next problem. As we stated earlier, teams circumvented the FIA's rules in their own way. As a result, the FIA needed help to develop a uniform set of rules that would address every team and what they were doing to walk around the original Flexi-Wing policy. If the FIA focused on one team's strategy, they could change their designs and use something similar to what any of the competitors on the grid were doing. However, ahead of the 2014 Formula One season, there was some progress on this front. The FIA decided to change the regulations regarding the width of the wing, meaning that the measurements would change when the agency conducted load tests. Then, in 2017, the FIA came with a new set of rules, changing the straight edge-leading design of the main plane and instead implementing the swept-back arrowhead design. This design switch meant that the entire wing was changed, with teams now having to realign their design aspects and head back to the drawing board concerning how they'd be able to circumvent the FIA's rules once more. Nevertheless, it appeared that teams still managed to get ahead of this trend. For instance, Red Bull vehicles soon appeared to have front wings with foot plates that rotated at a different rate compared to the rest of the wing. Thanks to this design innovation, the foot plate could interact differently with wind pressure than the rest of the wing, depending on the car's speed. All in all, this would switch the wake turbulence action created by the front tire and optimize aerodynamic performance for the car overall. Up to the present day. Subsequent rule changes have caused this act of circumventing Flexi-Wing laws to drop. But once again, a new trend appears to be pushing things even further. If you've noticed something with the FIA, their action against Flexi-Wings has been targeted specifically at the wings. However, the agency is now looking to police the internal structures of these wings these days. Ahead of the Dutch Grand Prix last month, the FIA announced a new draft rule change for teams, explaining what it believed to be the use of regions of purposely designed localized compliance, as well as relative motion between adjacent components to get a boost in aerodynamic performance. The agency highlighted several features that were believed to violate its technical standards, including wing elements that translate relative to the bodywork and designs that use elastomeric fillets. To clamp down on these features, the FIA now requires teams to provide cross-sections and assembly drawings that show the attachment of front wing components to their vehicle's noses, as well as the rear wing attachments, vis-a-vis components and end plates. All specs are to come with photos demonstrating how rear wing pylons are attached to the rear impact structure, thus giving the FIA more insight into how individual cars operate. As expected, the goal is to ensure total compliance with Article 3.22. Teams will need to ensure that the drawings they submit match the designs of their cars. To make things even more interesting, these designs are set to be implemented ahead of the Singapore Grand Prix, which will be held on September 17th. Since the rule changes were announced just over a month ago, teams are now racing against time to ensure compliance. So far, the FIA has said that its rule changes aren't targeted at any team or meant to make any team switch their operations drastically. However, its goal is to ensure everyone has a level playing field and that no one falls short of its requirements. Teams had until September 8th to submit their drawings and designs, so the FIA has about a week to review them and approve or deny any. Will this affect teams? The changes proposed by the FIA will significantly impact team performances. As we explained earlier, teams have gone about working around the agency's rules in their own way. And with the agency now switching its playbook and looking into the internal structures of the wings, who knows what could happen. What we do know, however, is that the brightest design minds in Formula One are working around the clock to develop design structures that can give their teams the necessary aerodynamic advantage while also staying within the FIA's guidelines. Will this be enough to give each team an edge? Will we notice drops in the performances of some drivers? Only time will tell.